remember the smell of disinfectant mixing with burned flesh, and how my hands never stopped shaking for the first month, and how after the first year they never shook at all, and that was when I knew something inside me had broken in a way that could never be repaired. They told us during orientation that we were the unseen foundation of the Imperium's greatest achievement, that without us the orbital platform Terminus would cease to function within days, that our work was noble, even if it would never be acknowledged. And I believed them because I was 23 years old, and I had never left the manufacturing colonies of Sector 7, and I thought that invisible work was still work that mattered. I thought that serving something larger than myself would give my life meaning. I thought many things in those early days that seem now like the delusions of a child who had never truly seen what empires are built upon. The hiring officer who processed my contract had dead eyes and a mechanical hand, and he never looked at me directly. And when I signed the 50-page document that bound me to a 7-year service term, he said only that I should read Section 47 carefully, which detailed the penalty for breaking confidentiality, and Section 83, which detailed the penalty for desertion. And both penalties were the same, and both penalties were D. He stamped my identification card with a number 74,827, and told me that I would report to Bay 14 for orientation at 0600 hours, and that I should bring nothing with me because everything I needed would be provided, and that I should say goodbye to anyone I cared about, because communication with the surface colonies was restricted for maintenance personnel, and that restriction had no end date listed in the contract. I arrived on Terminus 3 days later, processed through cargo transport along with 40 other maintenance workers, all of us wearing the same gray coveralls with our numbers stenciled across the back. All of us silent because there was nothing to say, and because the transport officer had made it clear that conversation during transport was considered a breach of protocol. The transport bay where we docked was larger than any structure I had ever seen, a cathedral of steel and flickering lights that stretched so far in every direction that I could not see the walls, only the distant glow of other ships arriving and departing, an endless circulation of materials and personnel that never stopped, never paused, never acknowledged that we were anything more than components in a machine too vast to comprehend. The orientation lasted 4 hours and covered everything except what mattered. They showed us how to operate the cleaning equipment, the industrial sanitizers that could dissolve organic matter in seconds, the sealant sprayers that could patch hull breaches, the waste processors that compressed refuse into dense cubes for ejection into space. They showed us the layout of our assigned sectors, the endless corridors and chambers and maintenance shafts that we would spend every waking hour navigating. They showed us the schedule, the 12-hour shifts that would consume our lives, the 4 hours of mandatory rest, the 2 hours of mealtime, the 6 hours of sleep if we were efficient. If we didn't waste time, if we understood that our time belonged to the Imperium, and the Imperium's time was always urgent. They did not show us the bodies. They did not explain what happened in the chambers we would clean. They did not mention that maintenance workers had the highest mortality rate of any personnel classification on Terminus, or that most of us would not survive our 7-year contracts, or that the confidentiality agreements we had signed meant that even if we wanted to warn others, even if we wanted to tell the truth about what happened in the dark places of the station, we would be executed before we could speak. My assigned sector was level 47, subsection D, a network of corridors and chambers deep in the station's interior where the officers and administrators lived and worked, where the real business of the Imperium was conducted, where decisions were made that would determine the fates of billions of people across hundreds of worlds, and where I would spend 7 years removing the evidence of those decisions from floors and walls and ventilate. My supervisor was a woman named Kale, 50 years old with burn scars covering half her face and a voice like grinding metal, and she had been on Terminus for 19 years, which meant she had voluntarily extended her contract twice, which meant she had nowhere else to go, or nothing left to go back to. Or she had simply forgotten that there was anything beyond these corridors and chambers, and the endless work of making them She took me to my first assignment on my second day, After I had spent the first day learning to operate the equipment, learning to navigate the service passages that ran behind the walls like veins behind skin, learning to move quickly and silently because maintenance workers who drew attention to themselves did not last long. The assignment was in Officers' Quarters 7, a suite of rooms where a lieutenant commander lived when he was not on duty, and Kale opened the door with her master key and the smell hit me immediately. The smell of death and chemicals and something else, something sweet and rotten, that I would later learn was the smell of fear, the smell that living bodies produce when they know they are about to die. The lieutenant commander was not there. The body in his bed was a woman, young, maybe my age, with dark hair and wide eyes that stared at nothing, and there was blood on the sheets and blood on the walls and blood on the floor. And Kale handed me a sanitizer and told me to start with the walls and work my way down. And I stood there frozen because I had never seen a dead body before, because I had never imagined that this was what they meant by me. I started with the walls. I sprayed the sanitizer and watched the blood dissolve and run down to the floor in pink streams, and I tried not to think about who the woman had been, whether she had family, whether anyone knew she was here, whether anyone would report her missing. And Kale stood in the doorway and told me that thinking was a luxury that maintenance workers could not afford, that the only thing that mattered was the work, that the work was all that kept us alive, that the work was all that kept you alive. The woman's body was heavier than I expected when Kale and I lifted her into the waste processor bag, and her skin was cold, and her eyes were still open, and I reached to close them because it seemed like something someone should do. And Kale grabbed my wrist and told me never to touch the bodies more than necessary, never to look at their faces, We sealed the bag and loaded it onto the transport cart and took it to the waste processing center on level 23, where a board technician scanned the barcode on the bag and logged it as organic waste and asked no questions and showed no interest. And the bag disappeared into the processor, and I heard the grinding mechanism engage, and I understood that the woman who had been alive yesterday no longer existed in any form that could be recognized as human, that she had been reduced to her component molecules, that those molecules would be compressed and ejected into space, that she would drift forever in the void between stars, and no one would know, and no one would care, and this was just the beginning of my first week. The hum of the reactor was constant, a low vibration that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears, and it never stopped, never varied, never gave any indication that it was anything other than eternal. And after the first month, I realized that I had started timing my breathing to match its rhythm, that I had started moving in sync with its pulse, that my heartbeat had adjusted itself to harmonize with the vast machinery, that I am alive. The jobs came in constantly, transmitted directly to Kale's datapad, and she would assign them to our team of 6 workers based on complexity and urgency. And she never explained what had happened or why we were needed, and we learned not to ask. We cleaned conference rooms where negotiations had ended in violence. We cleaned storage chambers where prisoners had been interrogated. We cleaned officers' quarters where accidents had occurred that were never accidents. We cleaned medical bays where experimental procedures had been conducted. We cleaned airlocks where people had been exposed to vacuum. We cleaned everything, and we documented nothing, and the officers and administrators walked past us as if we were invisible, as if we were part of the station's infrastructure, as if we were no more worthy of notice than the ventilation fans or the lighting panels. There was a rhythm to the work that became almost meditative after the first few months, a sequence of actions that required no thought, no emotion, no engagement with the reality of what we were doing. Scan the room. Assess the damage. Retrieve the appropriate equipment. Apply the sanitizers. Remove the biological material. Down. Seal the waste. Process the documentation. Move to the next assignment. No. The rhythm protected us from thinking too deeply about what we were cleaning, about whose blood we were dissolving, about whose bodies we were processing, about what kind of empire required an entire class of workers dedicated solely to erasing the evidence of its atrocities. I learned the patterns. Tuesday mornings were always busy because Monday nights were when the officers had their recreational time, and recreational time often ended with someone dying in ways that required professional cleaning. Thursday afternoons were slow because that was when the administrators had their policy meetings, and policy meetings rarely produced immediate physical evidence that needed removal. Friday evenings were unpredictable because that was when the transport ships arrived from the occupied colonies, and the transport ships brought prisoners and conscripts and refugees, and what happened to them in the processing centers was work that we would clean up over the weekend. I learned which officers were dangerous and which were merely cruel, which administrators filed complaints for minor infractions, and which ignored us entirely, which sectors of the station were relatively safe, and which were death traps for maintenance workers who stayed too long or saw too much. I learned that the medical bays on level 34 were where they conducted the experiments that no medical board would approve, and that the bodies that came out of those experiments were often still alive in ways that made death seem merciful, and that the screaming from those chambers could be heard through the ventilation system, and that everyone pretended not to hear. I learned that the detention centers on level 19 were where they kept the political prisoners, the people who had spoken against the Imperium or harbored rebel sympathies or simply failed to demonstrate sufficient loyalty, and that those prisoners rarely left the detention centers alive, and that when we were called to clean those cells, the walls, but were often covered not just with blood, but with messages, desperate scratched words, proclaiming. I learned that the conference rooms on level 52 were where they planned the orbital bombardments, where they selected which cities would be reduced to glass, which populations would be culled, which planets would be made examples, and that after those meetings there was often champagne and celebration, and sometimes the celebrations turned violent, and sometimes we would find officers dead from overdoses or murder, and sometimes we would find officers dead from overdoses. The other workers on my team were all survivors of their own traumas, all people who had nothing left to lose or nowhere else to go, all people who had made the calculation that 7 years in hell was better than whatever waited for them in the world they had left behind. There was Marcus, who had been a medic in the Imperium's colonial wars and had seen things that made cleaning bodies seem peaceful by comparison. There was Yara, who had lost her entire family when their colony was accused of harboring rebels, and the Imperium's response was to sterilize the entire planetary surface. There was Chen, who never spoke about his past, but had the kind of scars that suggested he had once been on the other side of the door, had once been the one creating the messes we cleaned, and now he worked in silence with the dedication of someone seeking penance for sins that could never be forgiven. We worked together, but we did not become friends, because friendship required vulnerability, and vulnerability was fatal in a place like Terminus, because caring about someone meant watching them die eventually, because everyone died on Terminus eventually, either from accidents or violence, or simply from the accumulated weight of what they had seen and done. And it was easier to remain isolated, to focus on the work, to let the rhythm of the job consume every. There were moments, brief and rare, when the isolation broke, when one of us would say something that acknowledged the horror of what we did, when we would share a look that communicated everything that could not be spoken aloud, when we would work together on a particularly terrible scene, and our movements would synchronize in a way that felt almost like solidarity, almost like resistance, almost like a recognition that we were still human despite. Those moments never lasted long. Kale would appear and remind us that we were behind schedule, that there were 6 more jobs waiting, that sentiment was a luxury we could not afford, and we would return to the work, return to the rhythm, return to the protective numbness that kept us functional. The smell of coolant became my constant companion, a sharp chemical scent that permeated everything on Terminus, that clung to my clothes and my hair and my skin, no matter how many times I showered, that I tasted when I ate, and smelled when I slept, and breathed with every inhale. And it became the scent of my life, the scent of survival, the scent that meant I was still working, still useful, still alive for another day. After 6 months, I stopped having dreams. Sleep became a period of empty darkness, a void without images or narratives, just a cessation of consciousness that lasted until the alarm signaled the start of another shift. The other workers told me this was normal, that dreams were the mind's way of processing experience, and that eventually the mind gave up trying to process what we experienced. that it simply shut down the parts of itself that tried to make meaning from horror, that we became machines that worked and ate and slept and nothing more. After 8 months, I stopped recognizing myself in the mirrors. The face that looked back was gaunt and hollow-eyed, older than my 24 years, marked by a kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure, and I would stare at this stranger and try to remember who I had been before Terminus, what I had wanted from life, what dreams I had cherished, and I could not remember, could not access those memories, could not believe that they had ever been real. After 10 months, I stopped counting the bodies. There were too many, and they all blurred together into a continuous stream of flesh and blood and bone, and trying to maintain a count felt like trying to hold on to something that would destroy me if I succeeded. So I let the count dissolve into approximation, into categories rather than individuals, into a general sense that the bodies never stopped coming, and would never stop coming, and would outlast my 7-year contract, and everyone after. We're all dead. The rumors circulated constantly through the maintenance crews, passed along in brief whispered conversations during mealtimes, or in the rare moments when we crossed paths with workers from other sectors. Rumors about what Terminus really was, about what purpose it served, about what the Imperium was building in the secret construction zones that even maintenance workers were not allowed to access. Some said it was a weapon, something that could destroy entire star systems. Some said it was a prison, a place where the Imperium kept the enemies it could not kill, but could not afford to release. Some said it was a laboratory, where they developed new technologies of control and subjugation. Some said it was all of these things, that Terminus was the dark heart of the Imperium, the place where all the cruelty and violence and oppression that maintained their power was concentrated and refined and exported to the rest of the galaxy. I did not know what to believe. I knew only what I saw in the rooms I cleaned, the evidence of systematic brutality, the signs of torture and murder and experimentation, the casual disregard for life that characterized every level of the station's operation. I knew that whatever Terminus was, it was not something the Imperium would ever acknowledge publicly, not something they would admit existed, not something that appeared in any official records or reports. We were cleaning up the evidence of crimes that officially never happened, disposing of victims who officially never existed, maintaining the infrastructure of an atrocity that the galaxy was not allowed to know about. The first time I saw someone executed for a contract violation, I was 4 months into my service, cleaning a corridor on level 45 when the alarm sounded. A sharp electronic screech that meant all personnel should stop and observe. That what was about to happen was meant to be witnessed, was meant to be a lesson, was meant to be a lesson, was meant to remind us of the consequences of disobedience. The maintenance worker was a man I had seen in the meal hall, older than most of us, maybe in his 50s, and he was dragged through the corridor by 2 security officers, while Kale and every other supervisor stood at attention. And we stood behind them, forced to watch, forced to learn. The charges were read from a datapad in a flat bureaucratic voice that made murder sound like an administrative procedure. The worker had been caught attempting to send a message to the surface colonies, had violated his confidentiality agreement, had broken the terms of his contract, and the penalty for breaking the contract was death. And the execution would be carried out immediately to ensure that all personnel understood the absolute nature of their obligations to the Imperium. They put him in the airlock without a suit. They sealed the inner door and activated the external door, and through the small window we watched him die. Watched his body convulse as the atmosphere was sucked into space, watched his blood boil and his lungs collapse, and his eyes burst, and it took 43 seconds. And I know because I counted every one of them. And when it was over, they left his body floating in the airlock for 3 hours before they retrieve it. Left it there as a reminder. The next day, we were assigned to clean the airlock, to remove the biological residue from the walls and floor and window, to sanitize the space so it could be used again, so the cycle could continue, so another lesson could be taught when another worker forgot that their life belonged to the Imperium, and the Imperium could revoke it at any moment for any reason. After that, I stopped thinking about the 7 years, stopped imagining what I would do when my contract ended, stopped believing that I would survive long enough to leave Terminus. I understood that the contract was a lie, that 7 years was a number meant to give us false hope. meant to make us believe that survival was possible if we just obeyed and worked and kept our heads down, when the truth was that the mortality rate made survival unlikely. And even if we physically survived, the Imperium would never let us leave with the knowledge we had accumulated. We were already dead. We just hadn't stopped working yet. The work continued, relentless and unchanging, and the seasons passed without marking themselves in any way, because there were no seasons on Terminus, no weather, no cycles of light and darkness, beyond the artificial rhythms of the shift schedules, no indication that time was moving forward, rather than simply repeating the same moment endlessly. My first year ended and my second began, and I could not identify the transition, could not point to any change in my circumstances, or my duties, or my understanding of what I had become. The bodies kept coming. The rooms kept needing to be cleaned. The evidence kept needing to be erased. And we kept working, because working was all we had left, because stopping meant dying, because dying meant we had wasted whatever time we had spent surviving. And the human mind will construct meaning from anything, if the alternative is accepting that existence is meaningless. During my second year, I began to notice the patterns in the violence, the rhythms of brutality that governed life on Terminus. There were cycles of escalation that corresponded with political events I only heard about through fragments of overheard conversations, rebellions on distant planets that led to increased interrogations in the detention centers, diplomatic failures that led to violent outbursts in the officers' quarters, military setbacks that led to purges of suspected traitors, and all of it filtered down to us as work, as rooms that need to be cleaned, as bodies that need to be crushed. I began to understand that we were not just maintaining Terminus, we were maintaining the Imperium itself, that without us the evidence would accumulate, the bodies would pile up, the truth would become visible, and the carefully constructed fiction of civilized imperial rule would collapse under the weight of its own atrocities. We were the ones who made it possible for the officers and administrators to sleep at night, who removed the physical proof of what they had done, who allowed them to pretend that their hands were clean, that their decisions were justified, that the violence they ordered was necessary and controlled and regrettable, but ultimately in service of a greater good. We were accomplices, every one of us, complicit in every murder and torture and experiment, and the fact that we had no choice did not change the reality of our complicity, did not absolve us of our participation in the machinery of oppression, did not make us innocent. We were survivors, and survival in a place like Terminus required compromise, required moral flexibility, required the ability to separate our actions from their consequences, and every day we made that separation, and every day it became easier, and every day we moved further from whatever humanity we had once possessed. Kale told me once, during a rare moment when we were alone, processing a particularly difficult scene, that she had stopped believing in justice during her third year, that she had realized that the universe did not care about right or wrong. That power was the only thing that mattered, that the Imperium would continue because it had the power to continue, and we would continue serving it because we did not have the power to stop, and any philosophy that suggested otherwise. I asked her why she had stayed for 19 years, why she had extended her contract twice, and she looked at me with those burned eyes and said that she had nowhere else to go, that she had cleaned too many rooms and processed too many bodies and erased too much evidence, that she was as much a part of Terminus as the reactor, or the corridors, or the airlocks, that leaving would mean admitting that 19 years of her life had been wasted in service of something else. So she stayed, and she worked, and she supervised us with the same flat efficiency that characterized everything on Terminus, and I understood that I was looking at my future, that this was what survival looked like, that if I made it through my 7 years, I would probably extend my contract, because the alternative was confronting what I had done, and confrontation meant guilt, and death was the only escape that the Imperium allowed. The smell of disinfectant and burned flesh became so familiar that I stopped noticing it, became so constant that I only noticed its absence on the rare occasions when I was assigned to clean a sector where nothing terrible had happened recently, where the work was routine maintenance rather than atrocity erasure, and those occasions were so rare and so brief that they felt like hallucinations, like glimpses of an alternate reality, where Terminus. But those glimpses never lasted, because there was always another job, always another body, always another room, where violence had occurred and needed to be sanitized, and the routine maintenance was just the interval between atrocities, the breath between screams, the moment of false calm before the next wave of horror crashed over us. During my third year, something changed in me that I could not name, a fundamental shift in how I experienced reality, a disconnection between my consciousness and my actions that allowed me to work without thinking, to process bodies without seeing them as human, to erase evidence without considering what it proved. And this disconnection was both a survival mechanism and a kind of death, a death of the part of me that had once believed that every life mattered. I became efficient. No, I became fast. I became one of Kale's best workers, someone she could assign to the most difficult jobs without worrying that I would break, that I would hesitate, that I would fail to complete the work. I became what Terminus needed me to be, and in becoming that I ceased to be what I had been, and I did not mourn the loss because mourning required the capacity for emotion, and emotion was a liability in a place where every feeling was a potential weakness that could be exploited or punished, or simply ignored until it atrophied. The other workers noticed the change. Marcus told me I had dead eyes now, that I looked like Kale, that I was becoming one of the lifers, one of the people who would never leave because they had been too thoroughly integrated into the station's structure. Yara stopped talking to me during mealtimes, stopped acknowledging me beyond what the work required, and I understood that she saw me as lost, as someone who had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, as someone who had become part of the problem rather than a victim of it. Shen said nothing, but he worked beside me with a kind of resigned solidarity, and I thought that maybe he recognized in me what he had experienced himself, the transformation from person to function, the surrender of identity in exchange for survival, the bargain that everyone on Terminus eventually made if they stayed long enough. The bodies kept coming, but their faces stopped mattering, stopped registering as individual humans with stories and families and futures that had been stolen from them. They became objects, problems to be solved, mass to be processed, and the efficiency with which I could reduce a human being to disposable waste became a source of professional pride, became something I measured and tried to improve, became the only metric of success available to me. I understood that I had become a monster, but I also understood that I had become a monster, but I also understood that I had become a monster, but I Alterian. The hum of the reactor continued, unchanging and eternal, and my heartbeat continued to synchronize with it, and I continued to work, and the work continued to erase any evidence that the people we processed had ever existed, and the Imperium continued to function, continued to expand, continued to expand, continued to expand. Order was good, that the Imperium brought stability and prosperity, and they believed that order was good, that the Imperium... During my fourth year, there was an incident that almost broke me, that came closer to shattering my carefully constructed disconnection than anything that had happened before. We were called to a residential sector on level 63, a section where the civilian contractors lived, the engineers and technicians and administrative staff who were not military personnel, but who served the Imperium in ways that did not require them to be soldiers. These were people who had been told they were valuable, who had been promised comfortable quarters and good pay, and the prestige of working on the Imperium's greatest achievement, who believed they were building something important rather than maintaining something monstrous. The residential unit we were sent to clean belonged to a young engineer, a woman named Sarah Talvek, according to the work order. And when we entered the unit, it was immediately clear that this had not been a typical officer's quarters incident, that this had been something different, something worse. The unit was small, a single room with a bed and a desk and a small kitchenette, and it was filled with children's drawings, dozens of them taped to the walls, crude images of planets and stars and families. And on the desk was a data pad displaying a photograph of two young children, maybe 5 and 7 years old, smiling at the camera. Sarah Talvek's body was on the floor beside the bed, and she had not been murdered by an officer during recreational time, had not been killed in an interrogation, had not died in an experiment. She had killed herself, and the method she had chosen was a knife, and the process had been slow and messy and desperate, and the walls were covered not just with blood but with words, with a suicide note written in blood that explained why she had chosen to die. Kale told me not to read it, told me to start with the sanitizer, but I read it anyway because I needed to know. because the disconnection that had protected me for 4 years suddenly felt like cowardice, because I needed to understand why someone with children and a good job and a comfortable life had chosen to bleed out alone in a tiny room on a station that promised them prestige and purpose. The note said that she had discovered what Terminus really was, that she had been assigned to work on a project in the restricted construction zones and had learned what the Imperium was building, that the knowledge had destroyed her, that she could not continue to contribute to something so evil, that she could not live with the guilt of what her engineering expertise had helped create, that she had tried to resign and been told that resignation was not possible, that her contract was binding the penalty. The note said that she hoped someone would find it, that someone would understand, that someone would tell her children that their mother had not abandoned them willingly, that she had been trapped by something larger than herself, that she had tried to do the right thing even though the right thing was impossible. And the note ended with the names of her children. And the note ended with the names of her children, and a plea that someone would remember that she had existed, that she had been human, that she had loved her children. I finished reading and looked at Kale and saw that she was crying. The first time I had ever seen her cry. The first time I had seen any emotion on her burned face, beyond tired resignation. And she told me to sanitize the walls first, to erase the note before we processed the body. And I understood that she was giving Sarah Talek exactly what she had begged us not to give. Was erasing the evidence that she existed. Was ensuring that her children would never know what had happened. Was mating. I sprayed the sanitizer and watched the blood dissolve and the words disappear. And something inside me shattered in a way that I knew would never heal. Because I had just erased the last testament of a woman who had died trying to resist, who had chosen death over complicity, who had loved her children more than she had valued her own survival. And by erasing her words, I had completed her erasure, had made her sacrifice meaningless. We processed her body in silence, Kale and I, and we did not speak about what we had read, and we never spoke about it again. And the next day we received another work order, and we cleaned another room, and the work continued, because the work always continued, because the work always continued, because the Imperium needed us to make sure the evidence never accumulated, never became undeniable, never reached the point where even the officers and administrators who gave the orders could. But something had changed, and I could not go back to the disconnection that had protected me, could not stop seeing the faces of the people we processed, could not stop wondering about their stories and their families and their reasons for dying, and the efficiency that had made me valuable became harder to maintain. And I started making mistakes, taking too long, requesting breaks, showing signs of the breakdown that Kale and every other supervisor watch it for because breakdowns. Kale noticed. She took me aside after a shift and told me that I needed to get myself under control, that whatever had broken in me needed to be repaired or suppressed or cut out, that I could not afford to feel what I was feeling, that feeling would kill me as surely as a broken contract, or a violent officer, or an airlock malfunction. And she said this with a kind of desperate urgency that suggested she was trying to save me from the same thing, that had almost. I told her I would be fine. I told her I just needed a few days to adjust. I told her the lie that she needed to hear because telling her the truth would have meant admitting that I was broken, and admitting I was broken would have meant a contract violation, and a contract violation would have meant death, and I was not ready to die. Not yet, not while there was still a chance that I might find some way to make sense of what I had experienced, some way to transform my survival into something that mattered. But I did not know how to do that. I did not know how to make survival matter when survival meant complicity, when staying alive meant erasing the evidence of the Imperium's crimes, when every day of work made me more guilty, more responsible, more implicated in the machinery of oppression that crushed billions of people across hundreds of worlds. During my 5th year, the rumors reached us that there was a rebellion, that across the occupied colonies people were rising up against the Imperium, that military installations were being attacked, that supply lines were being disrupted, that something was changing, that the absolute power of the Empire was not absolute as we had been taught to believe. The rumors came from the new workers who arrived to replace the ones who had died, came from overheard conversations between officers, came from the increased security protocols, and the heightened tensions that permeated every level of the station. The officers became more violent. The interrogations in the detention centers became more brutal. The experiments in the medical bays became more desperate. And the work increased, because desperation produces bodies, because fear produces violence, because an empire that senses its own vulnerability becomes more savage in its attempts to maintain control. And all of that savagery filtered down to us as rooms that needed to be cleaned, as evidence that needed to be erased, as bodies that needed to be processed. We worked 18-hour shifts during the worst of it, slept for 4 hours if we were lucky, ate while standing in corridors between assignments, and the exhaustion accumulated until it became a kind of delirium, until reality became fluid and uncertain, until I could not remember whether I was cleaning a room I had cleaned yesterday, or a different room that just looked the same, until all the bodies blurred together in a single endless corpse. That we were trying to... Marcus died during one of those shifts, collapsed while we were cleaning a detention cell, just fell over and did not get up. And when the medical team arrived, they said it was cardiac arrest, brought on by exhaustion and malnutrition and stress. And they took his body away, and we finished cleaning the detention cell because the work did not stop for deaths. Not even the deaths of workers. Especially not the deaths of workers. Especially not the deaths of workers, because workers were the most. They sent us a replacement the next day, a young man who looked terrified and lost, and Kale gave him the same orientation she had given me 5 years earlier, and I watched him try to process what he was seeing. Watched him struggle with the same realizations I had struggled with. Watched him transform from a person who believed his work would matter into a person who understood that his work only mattered to the extent that it erased. I wanted to tell him something that would help, wanted to offer some wisdom or comfort or strategy for survival, but I had nothing to offer because I had not survived. Not really, because survival in Terminus was not survival in any meaningful sense, was just the continued operation of biological processes, while everything that made those processes worth maintaining slowly dissolved. The rebellion continued somewhere beyond our reach, and we heard fragments of news that suggested the Imperium was losing ground, that colonies were declaring independence, that military forces were defecting, that the absolute order that had governed the galaxy for generations was fracturing. And I felt something that might have been hope, except that hope required the belief that change was possible. And I had stopped believing in change, had started believing in change, had started believing that Terminus. But the officers believed in the threat, and their belief manifested as paranoia, as purges of suspected sympathizers, as random executions designed to reinforce discipline, as increased surveillance and decreased tolerance for any behavior that could be interpreted as dissent. And all of this created more work for us. More bodies, more rooms, more evidence that needed to be erased, and we worked until our hands bled and... Kale was arrested during my 6th year, taken from a work site by security officers who did not explain the charges, who did not allow her to speak, who simply secured her restraints and walked her away while we watched and understood that we would never see her again. The official record said she had been transferred to another sector, but we knew what transfers meant, knew that she would end up in a detention cell, or an airlock, or a medical bay, knew that eventually we would be assigned to clean up whatever remained of her. Her replacement was a man named Tovik, younger than Kale, harder, with the kind of cruelty that comes from insecurity rather than exhaustion, and he made it clear that he viewed maintenance workers as barely human, as things that existed to serve his convenience, as resources to be used up and discarded. And under his supervision, the work became even more brutal, even more explicitly designed to break whatever remained of our spirits. Yara killed herself 3 months after Kale disappeared, walked into an airlock during a shift, and activated the external door before anyone could stop her, and I understood why she had done it. Understood that she had reached the point where death was preferable to another day of work, where the accumulated weight of everything she had seen and done had become unbearable, where survival had stopped being a goal worth pursuit. We were assigned to clean the airlock, Tovik, and the new workers and I. And I looked at the biological residue that had been Yara, and I tried to remember what she had looked like when she smiled, whether she had ever smiled, whether any of us had ever smiled, and I could not remember, could not access those memories if they even existed. And I understood that I was losing my past, that the person I had been before Terminus was dissolving just as surely. As the bodies were distant, Chen disappeared during my 7th year, just failed to report for a shift, and Tovik filed a desertion report and security searched for him, and they never found him. never found any trace of him, and we speculated that maybe he had found some way to escape, some ventilation shaft or cargo transport that had carried him to freedom. But we did not really believe it because escape from Terminus was impossible, because the station was designed to contain us just as surely as it contained the prisoners in the detention centers. And more likely Chen had simply found some forgotten corner to die in, some maintenance shaft or storage chamber, where his body would decompose in peace, where he would avoid the indignity of being processed by the same system he had spent years serving. I was alone then, the last survivor of my original crew, working alongside people who had not known Kale or Marcus or Yara or Chen, who did not remember when things had been marginally less terrible, who had never known anything except Tovik's cruelty and the endless work and the bodies that never stopped coming. And I realized that I was becoming what Kale had been, that I was the veteran now, that I had accumulated knowledge and skills that made me valuable. The contract ended on a Tuesday morning during the middle of a shift, the exact moment 7 years after I had signed the document that had bound me to Terminus, and nothing happened. No announcement, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that I had fulfilled my obligation, and I finished the shift and reported for the next shift and the shift after that. And weeks passed, and then months passed, and then months. I realized that they were never going to release me, that the contract had been a lie from the beginning, that 7 years was just a number meant to make recruitment easier, and the reality was that no one left Terminus alive. No one escaped with the knowledge they had accumulated. No one escaped with the knowledge they had accumulated. No one was ever going to testify about what happened in the dark places of the Imperium's greatest achievement. I thought about Sarah Talvik then, about the engineer who had killed herself rather than continue to participate in something evil, about the note written in blood that I had erased, about her children, who would never know why their mother had died, and I understood that she had been braver than I was, that she had chosen principle over survival, that she had made her death mean something even if I had erased the evidence, and I considered following her example, considered shoot. But I did not have children to mourn me. I didn't have anyone who would wonder why I had died. I did not have any reason to believe that my death would be different from the thousands of other deaths I had processed, that it would mean anything, that it would change anything, that it would be anything other than one more body for some other maintenance worker to clean up and process and forget. So I continued to work, because working was the only thing I knew how to do, because stopping would require making a decision, and I had lost the capacity for making decisions, had spent 7 years learning to follow orders and erase evidence and process bodies, and those skills were all I had left, were the only things that proved I existed, were the only measure of my value in a system that measured value solely by fun. The smell of coolant and disinfectant and death had become so much a part of me that I could not imagine existing without it, could not imagine breathing air that did not carry those scents, could not imagine living in a place where the hum of the reactor was not the constant background rhythm of existence. And I understood that I had been absorbed into Terminus completely, that I was no longer separate from the station. During my 8th year, the rebellion reached Terminus itself, and we heard explosions in the distance, felt the station shake from impacts, watched the officers panic and the security forces mobilize, and the security contractors try to evacuate. And for a brief moment I felt something that might have been hope, might have been the belief that change was possible, that the system that had consumed me might finally be destroyed, that the evidence I had spent. But the rebellion never reached our sector. The security forces repelled the attack, killed the insurgents, restored order, and within days, the station was functioning normally again. And the only evidence that anything had happened was the increased number of bodies that needed to be processed, the increased amount of blood that needed to be cleaned, the increased volume of evidence that needed to be erased. Tovik was killed during the attack, caught in an explosion that destroyed an entire corridor, and his replacement was a woman named Vex, who was worse, who had survived 23 years on Terminus and had become something that barely resembled human, who gave orders with a mechanical precision that suggested she had stopped thinking of herself as a person and started thinking of herself as a component, a processor of information and distributor of tasks, and under her supervision. I worked under Vex for 2 more years, and during those years I stopped counting time. stopped marking the passage of days or months or anniversaries, stopped maintaining any sense of my own history or identity beyond the function I performed, and I became what the Imperium had always intended me to become: a perfect worker, someone who could process any amount of horror without breaking, someone who could erase any evidence without questioning, someone who could maintain the bodies kept coming, and I kept processing them, and the work continued, and the Imperium continued, and somewhere in the galaxy, people lived normal lives and believed that the order imposed by the Empire was good and necessary and just. And they believed that because people like me made sure they never saw the evidence that proved otherwise, because we cleaned the rooms and processed the bodies and erased the proof that their comfortable lives were built on foundations. I am 43 years old now, though I had to calculate that from my worker number because I have stopped tracking my own age, and I have been on Terminus for 20 years, and I will die here eventually, and when I die some other maintenance worker will process my body and clean the room where I died and erase any evidence that I existed, and the work will continue, and the Imperium will continue, and nothing will change because nothing can change because the system is too vast and too efficient. I think sometimes about the person I was before Terminus, about the young worker from Sector 7 who believed that invisible work was still work that mattered, who thought that serving something larger than himself would give his life meaning, who signed a 7-year contract without understanding, that contracts with empires are written in the blood of everyone who signs them, and I cannot connect that person to the thing I have become. I think about all the people I have processed, all the bodies I have reduced to disposable waste, all the evidence I have erased, and I try to calculate how many lives I have helped the Imperium destroy, how many murders I have facilitated, how many atrocities I have made invisible, and the number is too large to comprehend, too large to assign meaning to, too large to carry as guilt because guilt at large would be indistinguishable from that. I think about Sira Talvek and her children, and the note written in blood that I erased, and I understand that she was right, that sometimes the only moral choice is to refuse to participate, to choose death over complicity, to make your ending mean something, even if that meaning will be erased. And I understand that I will be erased, and I understand that I made the opposite choice, that I chose survival over principle, that I chose to participate rather than resist, and I think about the hum of the reactor, that constant low vibration that has synchronized with my heartbeat, that has become indistinguishable from the rhythm of my breathing, that has marked every moment of the last 20 years. And I understand that this sound will be the last thing I hear when I die, that it will continue long after I am gone, that it will outlast everyone currently alive on Terminus, that it represents the true permanence of the system we serve, the endlessness. I think about Kale and Marcus and Yara and Chen and all the other workers who died or disappeared or simply stopped being people and became functions. And I understand that we are all the same, that we are all components in a machine designed to make atrocity invisible, that our individual stories do not matter because we are not individuals. We are categories, we are maintenance workers, we are disposable, we are already. And I think about the galaxy beyond Terminus, about the billions of people who live their lives without knowing what happens in the dark places, without understanding what their comfortable order costs, without seeing the bodies or smelling the blood or hearing the screams. And I understand that this ignorance is not accidental, that it is maintained deliberately, that it requires the constant work of people like me to sustain, and that as long as the work continues. But no one will stop working because stopping means dying, and dying means admitting that your survival was meaningless, that your work was evil, that your life contributed nothing except to the perpetuation of systematic cruelty. And no one can admit that and remain sane. So we continue to work, we continue to process, we continue to work, we continue to clean, we continues, and the bodies continues. I received a new assignment yesterday, a routine job in officers' quarters on level 47, and when I entered the room I smelled ozone and disinfectant and death, and I saw the blood on the walls and the body on the floor, and I retrieved my equipment and started with the walls. And I worked with the efficiency that 20 years of practice has given me. And I processed the body and sealed the waste and documented the completion of the job. I am a maintenance worker on orbital platform Terminus, and I clean the rooms where the Imperium's crimes occur, and I process the bodies that prove those crimes happened, and I erase the evidence that would force anyone to acknowledge what this empire is built upon. And I do this work every day, and I will do this work until I die. And when I die, someone else will do it, and the work will never end, and the bodies will never stop coming. I was 23 years old when I signed the contract, and I believed that invisible work still mattered, and I was wrong, and I have spent 20 years learning exactly how wrong I was. And I will spend however many years I have left carrying the knowledge of that error. And when I die, that knowledge with that error. And when I die, that knowledge will die with me. And no one will know. And no one will care. And the work will continue. Because the work always continues. Because empires need workers more than workers need empires. Because someone has to clean the blood from the floors and the walls and the machinery. Because someone has to make the atrocities invisible. Because someone has to ensure that the comfortable people in the galaxy never have to confront what their comfort costs. I am that someone. I am worker 74,827, Emma. I am a maintenance worker on Terminus. I am invisible. I am disposable. I am already dead. And I am still working, because working is all I have left. Because stopping would require courage I do not possess. Because survival is the only victory available to people like me. And survival means participating, and participating, and participating means guilt. And guilt means that somewhere deep inside, the thing I have become, there is still a fragment of the person I was. Still a part of me that remembers that what I do is wrong. But that fragment is small and getting smaller, and soon it will disappear entirely, and I will become what Kale became. What Vex became? What all the long-term survivors become: a perfect processor, a perfect racer, a perfect servant of the Empire. And when that transformation is complete, I will stop suffering, because suffering requires the capacity to recognize that something is wrong, and I will have lost that capacity. And maybe that is what the Imperium has always intended. Maybe that is the true purpose of places like Terminus, not just to commit atrocities and erase evidence, but to transform people, to break them and rebuild them as components, to take individuals with hopes and dreams and futures and convert them into functions, into workers, into things that exist solely to serve the system. And maybe that transformation is more important to the Empire than any particular atrocity. I am being used. I have been used for 20 years. I will continue to be used until I cease to function. And when I cease to function, I will be processed just like the bodies I have spent my life processing, will be reduced to waste and ejected into space, will drift forever in the void between stars, and no one will remember my name, because no one ever knew my name, because I have always been a number, have always been a number, have always been a component. The smell of disinfectant is in my lungs with every breath. The hum of the reactor is in my heartbeat. The work is in my hands. The guilt is in whatever remains of my soul. And the Empire continues, vast and terrible and seemingly eternal, built on foundations of blood and maintained by the invisible labor of people who have no choice except to participate or die. And most of us choose to participate, because death requires more courage than survival, because dying means acknowledging that our survival was meaningless. An acknowledgement of meaningless. And acknowledgement of meaningless is the one thing that humans will do, almost. So we work. We clean, we process, we erase, and the Empire continues. And the bodies continue to come, and nothing changes. And we tell ourselves that we had no choice, that we were trapped, that we were victims. And maybe that is true, maybe we are victims. But we are also accomplices, and both things are true simultaneously. And living with that contradiction is the price of survival in a place like Terminus, in an empire like this one, in a galaxy where power determines reality, and those without power must either serve or die. I chose to serve. I have served for 20 years. I will serve until I die. And my service has made the galaxy worse, has made atrocity possible, has made the Imperium's crimes invisible, has ensured that the comfortable people never have to confront what their comfort costs. And I know this. And I cannot stop. And that knowledge, that inability, that continuing despite knowing, that is what Terminus does to people. That is what the Imperium does to people. That is what empires have always done to people. And that is what they will continue to do as long as there are people willing to work, willing to serve, willing to trade their humanity for survival. I am willing. I have always been willing. That is my crime. That is my confession. That is my fate. Ooh, I am a maintenance worker on Terminus. I am invisible. I am disposable. Hey, I am already dead. And the work continues. And I continue. And everything continues. Because that is what empires do. They continue. Daisy wise, I'm trouble. Now are lesser. Until someone stops them. And no one will stop them. Because we are all too busy cleaning up their messes. Well, too busy erasing their crimes. Too busy surviving. Too busy to resist. Too broken to fight. Too afraid to die. Too guilty to live. Too trapped to escape. And the hum of the reactor continues, eternal and unchanging, the heartbeat of the Empire, the rhythm of oppression, the sound of machinery grinding human beings into components. And my heart beats with it, synchronized, indistinguishable, until I cannot tell where the machine ends and I begin, until I am not a person working on a station, but a part of the station itself, flesh and metal, merged into a single system. The Toa. And that is the truth they never tell you when you sign the contract. That is the reality they never explain during orientation. That is the fate that awaits everyone who enters Terminus. Not death, not suffering, but transformation, conversion, to the slow dissolution of everything that makes you human, and the slow construction of something else in its place, something that can work forever without breaking, something that can process endless horror without flinching, something that serves the Empire perfectly because it has forgotten that anything except Empire ever existed. I remember the smell of ozone when I first arrived. I remember thinking my work would matter. I remember being 23 years old. I remember being human. But those memories are fading now, distant and unreal, like stories about someone else, someone I used to know, someone who died a long time ago and left behind only this worker, this number, this function, this thing that cleans rooms and processes bodies and erases evidence and continues, always continues, because continuation is all that remains when everything else has been taken away. I am worker 74,827 mm. I am a maintenance worker on orbital platform Terminus. I am invisible. I am disposable. I am already dead. And I am still working. And I will work tomorrow. And the day after tomorrow. And the day after that. Until I stop. Until I cannot continue. Until the machinery finally consumes the last fragment of whatever I once was. And when that day comes, someone else will clean up what remains. Someone else will process my body. Someone else will erase the evidence that I ever existed. And the work will continue. And the Empire will continue. And nothing will change. Because nothing ever changes. Because we are the ones who make sure nothing changes. Because that is what maintenance workers do. We maintain. We preserve. We ensure that everything continues exactly as it is, exactly as it has always been, exactly as it will always be, forever and ever, until the